Hi, everyone. I am back to do your 4.3 notes with you. You should have your interactive notebooks out and you should be ready to take notes. You should have your textbooks open to page 260 so that you can follow along and fill in some diagrams along the way. Just to review, in 4.1, we talked a lot about fossils, different types of fossils, and what we can learn from different things in the Earth's surface. And in 4.2, we talked about how we can tell the age of different rock layers by relative dating. That's not going to give me the actual age. And then in 4.3, we're going to talk about absolute dating. Absolute dating is going to give me the actual age of a rock in years. So, absolute dating, like I said, is finding the actual age of an event or object in years. And the way we figure this out is by using radioactive isotopes. That sounds really confusing, but what radioactive means is that it's unstable. So when an element is radioactive, it's unstable. And these unstable elements want to be stable. So as that happens, as these radioactive elements slowly break down into stable versions of these elements, this is what we call radioactive decay. Another word for radioactive or unstable isotopes, we call those parent isotopes. And when they break down into the stable element, we call that the daughter isotope. So when I say radioactive or unstable or parent isotope, I'm talking about the same thing. And when I talk about stable, I'm talking about the daughter isotope, and those are the same thing as well. The measure of time it takes for this to happen is what we call a half-life. So the half-life of a sample is the amount of time it takes for half of that sample to go from parent to daughter isotope. So half-life is the time it takes for half of a sample of a parent isotope to decay into a daughter isotope. For different elements, there's different half-lives. So for instance, carbon has a very short half-life, relatively speaking, and uranium has a very long half-life. They're good for dating different things. We'll get to that a little bit later in this section. But what's important is that half-life always means the same thing as a concept, but in number of years, it's different from one element to the next. This graph is just going to show you kind of how this radioactive decay kind of works and how we measure half-lives. So this sample right here is showing all radioactive parent isotopes. And you can see on my y-axis here, I have 100% parent isotope in my sample. After one half-life, I have 50% parent isotope. So I have 50% of these red bubbles and then 50% of these gray bubbles, which are representing my daughter isotope. After two half-lives, and it's the same amount of time that has gone by, I have now 25% parent isotope and 75% daughter isotope. After a third half-life, now I have 12.5% parent isotope and I have 87.5% daughter isotope. So slowly but surely, the parent isotope is getting cut in half every half-life. If I were to go for another one, I would end up with 6.25% parent isotope. It just keeps going and gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but it gets cut in half every single time. We call this radiometric dating. When we figure out the age of a rock by using this half-life formula, we call this radiometric dating. If you can take a sample of rock and you can find the ratio of parent to daughter isotope in that sample, then you should be able to figure out how old that rock is. So if you know the amount of parent and daughter isotopes that are in a sample, and you know how fast those isotopes decay, or that element will decay, that means how long it takes for that element to break down from radioactive to stable, then you could calculate that sample's absolute age. This example is on page 261, so you should be following along with me. In the book here, it starts out with 16 green bubbles. That's going to represent parent isotopes. So in my little sample here, I've got 16 little bubbles representing 100% of the sample being unstable radioactive parent isotope. After one half-life, I've got 50% parent isotope. So I've got still half of them are these green bubbles, but then 50% have decayed into the stable daughter isotope. That's represented by those purple bubbles up here. After a second half-life, now that 50% of the green ones, that has been cut in half. So now I have 4 parent isotopes. And for my daughter isotope, I have 12. So now I only have 25% of my sample is parent isotope. Then after yet another half-life, I've got only 2 parent isotopes and 14 daughter isotopes. That will be 1/8 of the sample is still parent isotope. So you can see by looking at the ratios, I have 100% is radioactive here, and then 1/2 is radioactive here, then 1/4 is radioactive here, and 1/8 is radioactive. So it keeps getting cut in half after every single half-life. We can only do this with igneous rock. So what type of rock is best for radiometric dating? Usually we're going to be doing this with igneous rock. We can also do this with some past living organisms if they have carbon in them. But if I'm trying to date a type of rock, igneous rock is best. That's because when it forms, those minerals are often 100% radioactive. So as they break down in a pretty even way. And the samples are a lot easier to interpret. So when igneous rocks form, the minerals are often 100% parent isotope, so the percentages of parent to daughter in the same samples are easier to interpret. And this is just another graphic that illustrates, again, the concept of half-lives. So after 0 half-lives, my rock sample is 100% parent isotope. After 1 half-life, I have half and half parent to daughter. And after 2 half-lives, you can see I have only 25% parent isotope and about 75% daughter isotope. This example is from page 262 in your book. We're going to walk through the sample and then we'll do the one that asks us to do it. We'll do that one together as well. So you can see here, it says a crystal contains a radioactive isotope that has a half-life of 10,000 years. 1/4 of the parent isotope remains in the sample. How old is the sample? So basically we found a rock and we know whatever this element is, it doesn't tell us what it is, but whatever it is, it's got a half-life of 10,000 years. That means every time it breaks down from parent to daughter, for half of that sample to break down from parent to daughter, it's going to take 10,000 years for that to happen. If I just take this rock and I take it to a lab and I analyze it and I see that 1/4 of it is still radioactive, but the rest of it is daughter isotope, we want to figure out how old this thing is. So what do we know? We know that the half-life of this isotope is 10,000 years, and we know that about 1/4 of it, or 25%, is still parent isotope. What are we trying to figure out? We're trying to figure out how old the sample is. So we need to figure out how many half-lives have gone by. It wants us to draw the parent to daughter isotope ratios. So they did that here. First, after 0 half-lives, we've got 100% parent. After 1 half-life, we have 50-50. And after 2 half-lives, we have, it looks like 25% parent isotope, 75% daughter. That's what we're looking for. It asks us to solve it. The third drawing on the right shows a sample that contains 25% parent isotope. This amount is present after 2 half-lives have passed. Find the age of the sample. Because the half-life of the radioactive isotope is 10,000 years and 2 half-lives have passed, the age of the sample is, you multiply 2, which is the number of half-lives, times 10,000, which is the number of years for each half-life. And you get that this rock sample is 20,000 years old. Pretty simple, a lot of steps in there. It sounds way more complicated than it is. So now we're going to do our own example here. A crystal contains a radioactive isotope that has a half-life of 20,000 years. You analyze a sample and find that 1/8, or 12.5%, of the parent isotope remains. How old is the sample? Well, let's pick out what we know from this information. What do we know? We know that the sample has a half-life of 20,000 years, and we know that there is 1/8 of the parent isotope left, or 12.5%. What are we trying to figure out? Just like in the last problem, we want to know the age of the sample. It wants us to draw the parent to daughter isotope ratios on the right. I did this in little pie charts, so hopefully this is easy for you to understand. So after 0 half-lives, I have 100% parent isotope in my sample here. After 1 half-life, I would end up with 50% parent isotope and 50% daughter isotope. After another half-life, I would have 25% parent isotope and 75% stable daughter isotope. And then after another half-life, I would end up with 12.5% parent isotope and 87.5% daughter isotope. That's what we're looking for. We know that there's 12.5% parent isotopes here, so we know that this is the pie chart that most closely represents the sample from the problem. So figure out how many half-lives have passed. 1, 2, 3. So we know that that is going to be 3 half-lives. And then find the age of the sample. Well, we know that 3 half-lives have passed, and the half-life in this sample is 20,000 years. So my answer is that my sample is 60,000 years old. Hopefully that math was pretty easy for you. On your test, I'm not going to give you anything that's too complicated. It's all going to be very easy multiplication if you have to do any at all. So don't freak out about that. There are a couple different radiometric dating methods that we very commonly use. And the first one is radiocarbon dating. This is going to be used for organic remains. And when I say organic, I mean it was probably once alive. For plants or animals, things that we know lived not too long ago. Carbon-14 has a pretty relatively short half-life. It's a little under 6,000 years. So it's useful for things that have lived fairly recently. I'm not talking about dinosaurs. I'm talking about, things within the last tens of thousands of years. For example, we've gotten the ages of woolly mammoths by using radiocarbon dating, things like that. Another type of radiometric dating is potassium-argon dating. Potassium is pretty radioactive when it comes out of the earth, and it has a half-life of 1.25 billion years. This is good for dating things that are a little older than the things that we would use for radiocarbon dating. Useful for dating rocks that are between 100,000 and a few billion years old. The last one that we very commonly use is uranium-lead dating. This is used for things that are a lot older. Uranium has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. So it's useful for dating rocks that are between 100 million and billions of years old. So very, very useful for older rocks. How does radiometric dating determine the age of the Earth? Well, the first rocks that formed Earth are gone. They have either eroded away or they have been recycled back down into the asthenosphere. So we need to know how old the Earth is, but we've got to figure it out in a different way. Since the rocks that actually formed Earth have gone away, we can figure out the age of the Earth by studying space rocks, meteorites. Meteorites will find their way into our atmosphere and sometimes crash down onto Earth's surface, and we can study them when they get to us. We can also pick up moon rocks and get samples from the moon, and we can date those rocks radiometrically. That's how we are able to know that our Earth and our solar system roughly are about 4.6 billion years old. That's really, really old. Billion with a B. So the last concept we got to talk about here are index fossils. How can fossils help to determine the age of sedimentary rock? Well, since sedimentary rock cannot be dated radiometrically, we have to kind of figure out how old the igneous rock is around it. Sedimentary rock, remember, is made up of different bits and pieces of other rock. So we can't gauge the chemical composition. We can't measure how old it is and trust that for the age of when that sedimentary rock formed. So what we can do is we can find igneous rock layers around it and figure out the absolute age of those layers. And then we can also use index fossils to help figure out the age of sedimentary rock. We know that little word index, we've seen it a lot. It's used for reference. The index of your textbook will give you a reference of where to find things within your book. We talked about index contour lines with topographic maps. Those were those bold lines that we used to help us find the elevation of the lines around it. Index fossils are also used for reference. They're used to figure out the absolute age of the rock layers around them. In order for a fossil to be considered an index fossil, it has to meet a couple of qualifications. First of all, it's got to be pretty common. It has to be pretty well known. And it's got to be pretty unique. That means it has to have a lot of identifying characteristics where paleontologists can pick it out and geologists can pick it out and recognize it right away. It also needs to have lived for a short period of time. So when I find that fossil in a layer of rock, I know that layer of rock came from just this short period of time. You don't want to pick fossils that lived for billions and billions of years, because if that happened, then we wouldn't know what layer or what age that rock came from. We wouldn't be able to pinpoint what time of the Earth's history it came from. So how are they used? Like I said, they're used for reference. They act as a marker for the time that that organism lived on Earth. So if I find a trilobite in a layer of rock, then I know that that layer of rock came from when that trilobite lived. The book gives us an example about tropites. Tropite is a type of ammonite, kind of a squid ancestor here. Tropites lived between 230 to 208 million years ago. When we find them, we know that the rock we found them in is between 230 and 208 million years old. So this is an example from the book here. It wants us to figure out these little squigglies. Those are tropite fossils. It wants us to figure out the ages of the rock layers. It says place each of the following ages besides the correct rock layer. 215 million, 500 million, 100 million. Well, knowing what I know about tropites, they didn't live for a very long period of time, but they were very common when they did live. I know that they lived between that 208 and 230 million year range. So I can identify the layer that I find my tropite fossil is probably that 215. So 215 million years old is where I'm going to find that fossil. Anything above it is going to be younger than that. So that would be where my 100 million year old rock layer came from. And anything below it, remember with my with my relative dating rules here, anything below it is going to be older. So that would be my 500 million year old layer. Okay, so that is how index fossils are used. If you look in our Unit 4 videos and media links document that I shared with you, it's in Progress Book, you will see follow-up videos on both radiometric dating and index fossils that will also give you a pretty good review of what these concepts are. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I hope you were copying down all these notes. Make sure you have them written down in your interactive notebook. I will be back on Monday to review with you, and we will go back over all of this stuff. You should have enough information to do the 4.3 lesson review in your book as well. All right, we'll see you on Monday.